The man who had funded me for years went bankrupt, and he also lost his sight. I picked him up, carefully tending to him. With vacant eyes, he looked at me weakly and bitterly said, "Don't be so kind to me. I'm 30, I don't deserve you." I bent down to wipe the tears from his face. But then I noticed his adopted son, arms crossed, leaning nonchalantly against the wall, his gaze cold and sharp. The adopted son spoke softly, "Yeah, you're 30. He fixed his eyes on me, a sly smile curling at the corner of his lips. It was a smile laced with hidden barbs, the kind that could stir up a storm. "I'm only 18. In my 3rd year of work, I suddenly learned that Howard had fallen from grace. He lost a bet, went bankrupt, and the others even stomped on him while they were at it. He caused a car accident that left him blind. Howard just wasn't ruthless enough. A businessman with such a weak temperament was bound to lose," my colleagues chatted casually. "He used to be the most eligible bachelor in New York. Now look at him, he's worse than a beggar." "Chloe, what's wrong? You look pale," a colleague finally noticed me. I blankly stared at them for a moment, then without hesitation grabbed my bag. "Guys, I have something urgent to attend to this afternoon. I'm leaving early." 3 years ago, I never would have imagined that my reunion with Howard would take place outside a shabby little restaurant at the hospital. 3 years ago, he was a rising star, a young entrepreneur with the world at his feet. He even attended my graduation ceremony, charming, handsome, a spark that stirred campus forums for days. Now, his eyes were dull, his hands fumbling in helpless confusion. I noticed the stain on the table and quickly took his hand, wiping the surface carefully with a wet tissue. "Stop it, just say what you need to say," a voice snapped, loud and forceful. I turned, and saw a young college student, full of brash energy. His thick brows and buzz cut paired with silver earrings gave him a rebellious air. He tapped the table and said with a sharp tone, "I warn you, the money's all gone. Even if you search him from head to toe, you won't find a cent to pay you back, so stop pretending to be a good Samaritan." "Sorry, my son Kevin has a temper." "He didn't mean to offend you," Howard said softly. "Why are you being polite with her? Someone showing up at this time is definitely a creditor." "Kevin, enough." They began to talk. Howard's voice was low, trying to smooth things over, but Kevin was stubborn and relentless, every word challenging Howard until his face flushed with irritation. I stared at Howard, trying to keep him upright, watching him struggle. It took me a moment to realize that I was still holding his hand. I looked down. There was a small mole on his palm. Only when Howard's face turned even redder, and his confused gaze shifted toward me, did I release his hand. "Mr. Howard, you've misunderstood. I'm not here to collect a debt. My name is Chloe, the student you once sponsored." Howard blinked slowly when he heard my name, seemingly trying to recall. But he probably already forgot. He'd entered Yale, dropped out to pursue business, and had helped hundreds of students like me, if not more. Yet, suddenly, he smiled. It was as though he was transported back to 3 years ago, when he'd handed me a bouquet at my graduation ceremony, waving goodbye from behind a car window. "I remember you. All the other kids called me Big Brother, but you always called me Sir." He remembered me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the erratic beat of my heart. "Mr. Howard, if you don't mind, please stay at my place for now." Kevin crossed his arms. "He doesn't have the money to pay rent." "No need to pay." Kevin frowned. "He still has to spend money on medical treatment." "I'll pay for it." Kevin squinted. "You've got hands and feet, and you're not bad looking. Why take on a burden?" Howard also looked at me silently, confused and worried. I knocked on the table, feeling a flicker of annoyance at the word burden. My voice grew colder as I looked at Kevin, saying, 7 years ago, I couldn't afford to go to school. If it wasn't for Mr. Howard's help, I would have been stuck in poor and wasting my whole life." I sat up straight, speaking with sincerity. Chloe, will never forget this kindness. I came here to repay him. He is not my burden. I will support him, no matter what happens." Though the process was bumpy, Howard moved into my home. He hesitated, but there was little he could do. After all, he had no place to stay, no money, and the only person left with him was Kevin, his deceased brother's child, who had come to live with him. Kevin had just started college, and in my eyes, he was just a small-time delinquent. But he was Mr. Howard's adopted son, so I reluctantly tolerated him. After Howard went blind, many things became difficult for him. I took his sleeve and guided him around the house, letting him feel his way. He smiled and said I was being too much trouble, but that he had memorized the layout. That night, however, he confused the living room with the bedroom. I was lying on the sofa, fiddling with my phone when I saw him stop in his tracks, curious about what he was doing. I waited for a while, but he didn't call out to me, likely unaware I was here. I was about to speak when Howard, standing at the wall, suddenly began unbuttoning his shirt. Piece by piece, his bare chest began to emerge under the dim light, his skin pale and smooth. He wrapped the shirt around his arm, propped himself up with one hand on the wall, then he began undoing his belt with his other hand. I lay rigid on the sofa, regretting not speaking up sooner. Howard's skin was pale and lean, his muscles soft and well-defined, like a flawless jade in the moonlight. He was only wearing a pair of dark gray shorts, feeling his way along the wall as if he was trying to find his bed. But he had entered the wrong room. He fumbled around for a long time until he finally touched the TV. A brief flash of panic crossed his face. Howard was a man of pride, and he'd probably never done anything as bold as undressing in a stranger's living room before. His fingers trembled as he fumbled around, finally finding the door to the bedroom. He rushed inside, nearly fleeing. I had been stiff with tension, and as he disappeared into the guest bedroom, the breath I had been holding finally escaped in a shaky exhale. He had a mole on his left shoulder blade, so close to the armpit that it looked like a fish swimming in a small pond. Beautiful people have moles, I thought, for no reason at all. That night, I couldn't sleep. I waited until dawn before I finally felt that Howard was asleep. Carefully, I stood up from the sofa and silently made my way to my own bedroom. The first time I met Howard was in my high school. It was a shabby, run-down school. At that time, Howard was 23 years old, 3 years into his entrepreneurial journey, having secured his first round of funding. His future looked incredibly bright, full of promise. He was energetic, eager to do something good for the world. I stood at the back of the line, the crowd pressing around me, and I caught a glimpse of that handsome, lively face. He was so young, even more like a high school student than I, who was tired and lifeless. I knew the principal despised young men like him. He thought they were easy to manipulate, so he slipped a lot of connections into the scholarship list. As someone almost ready to drop out due to poverty, I ended up at the very bottom of the list. I had no expectations of the scholarship, standing at the end of the line, absent-mindedly wondering where I would work if I had to drop out. The line slowly shortened, and before long, it was my turn to stand before Howard. He smiled and crouched down, looking at my hands and the cuffs of my pants. Then, in a soft voice, he said, "I placed you at the top of the scholarship list. Focus on your studies, and don't worry about tuition for college in the future." Mr. Howard, the principal panicked. The first position on the scholarship list meant a substantial sum of money. Howard smiled and calmly countered, his expression gentle but his stance firm. I watched his profile, suddenly feeling like a wild fish that had stumbled into a clear pond, awkward and out of place. I instinctively pulled my hand back, inexplicably not wanting him to see my calloused, scarred hands and the ragged cuffs of my pants. Because a clear pond was meant for lotus flowers, not for muddy fish like me. Later, I saw him several times from a distance. Howard was a good person, persistent in his work. Our county was poor, and every semester, he came to sponsor students. Although we spoke a few times, our conversations were always about academics, and his concern for me was the same as for others. From high school to college, I wrote to him every month, one letter each month, careful not to send too many and annoy him, but also afraid that writing too few might make him forget me entirely. In my first letter, he jokingly asked me why I called him Mr. Howard. Other students called him brother or even just Howard. I didn't tell him the real reason. I wanted to be the only special one. Even if that special feeling was just my own secret fantasy. Like the fish in the pond, hiding in the corner, silently revering the pond as my little god, weaving stories no one else would ever know. Back then, I didn't understand what my fantasy was, or why I resisted calling him brother. Now, I finally understand. Because I had my first wet dream. The man of my wet dream was not those celebrities my friends constantly talked about, nor was it a blind date set up by a colleague. It was Howard. In the dream, he was lying back on my bed, his shirt loose, a playful smile at the corner of his lips, a faint blush on his cheeks. He asked me with a smile, "What should I call you?" In the dream, I held him tightly, mumbling, "Babe?" Then, I kissed the mole on his palm, his arm, and finally, the small red mole on his shoulder, making it bloom into a deep red blush. Howard softly groaned, whispering, "Chloe, I'll take the lead." He turned his face toward mine, squeezing my arm and gently kissing my wrist, his eyes glancing at me, seductive and tempting. "I'm older than you, and I know better. Let me teach you." At that point, I woke up with a start. The sound of the kitchen exhaust fan came from outside the room. I quickly put on my clothes and opened the door. In the kitchen, someone was flipping a frying pan with one hand, holding a cigarette in the other. He was bare-chested, wearing only a pair of jeans, my pink plaid apron draped over his shoulders, the straps winding around his back, making him appear fragile. He looked up at me, narrowing his eyes and glaring. "What time is it? Why aren't you up yet?" I forced a smile, about to take the frying pan from his hand. Kevin raised his hand to block me, and our arms bumped into each other. "I'm almost done," he said irritably. "By the way, call him over. He's too stubborn to bother anyone when staying at someone else's place." I quickly went to knock on the door of the guest room. "Come in." I pushed open the door. Howard was already awake, sitting up straight at the desk, feeling his way around a small statue. My heart skipped a beat. How could I have forgotten about that statue? I'd made it myself in pottery class. The figure looked about 80% like Howard. I nervously wondered if he had noticed. Howard looked up, and in the sunlight, his eyes were tinged with a grayish hue. He smiled gently, looking at nothing in particular, and said, "Thank you for taking me in. Did you made this?" "I can't quite tell what it is, but I'm sure it looks beautiful." "Yes, I made it." His fingers lightly traced the side of the statue's face, where a fingerprint, mine, had been left behind. I quickly took the statue and hid it in the cabinet, lying, "I made a tree. It's rough, so please don't take it." "A tree." Howard laughed softly. The smile suddenly reminded me of the dream I had last night. I blushed, feeling ashamed of my own thoughts. He was Howard, truly a gentleman, one destined to rise from hardship and be with a refined lady. But I was just an ordinary person whom he had helped, and now I had impure thoughts about my benefactor. How despicable of me. I cursed myself 1,000 times in my mind and finally managed to push that strange, ambiguous thought from my head. But I couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could my rationality last? Howard smiled softly at the sunlight, his expression calm. He probably didn't realize how close I had moved, so close I could see the fine hair on his cheek. He murmured, "Is that the sun?" "I think I can see a little light." "It's the sun. It's a very sunny day." I quietly watched him. The sunlight illuminated the world, but he illuminated me. In this small, square room, it was as if he was my own little god. Howard struggled with his meal, the fork occasionally clinking against the table. Unable to resist, I helped him to chop the meat. Howard's face turned red, and he seemed somewhat uncomfortable. Kevin didn't eat. He sat across from Howard and me, his arms crossed, silently staring for a long time without saying a word. I sighed, not knowing what was bothering him this time. He had been fine when cooking earlier. "Kevin, aren't you going to eat?" I asked. I already ate before my morning run. Not like you, sleeping in until noon, Kevin replied stiffly. Kevin. She has work to do, what's the problem with sleeping in on weekends? Howard frowned. Kevin looked at him expressionlessly, his lips barely moving as if grinding his teeth silently. Then, he suddenly extended his leg, leaning back in a mockingly exaggerated way, and drawled, "Yeah, it's the weekend. I'm staying here too." His leg nudged mine, and my knee instinctively brushed against Howard's. I immediately pulled away. It seemed like Howard didn't notice, though. He frowned and just said to Kevin, "Kevin. It's fine, I know you're worried about leaving Mr. Howard alone here," I quickly said. Howard didn't speak again. But when Kevin went to the bathroom to smoke, Howard unexpectedly reached over, touching my sleeve and leaning closer. After losing his sight, he couldn't control his distance. If I hadn't moved quickly, he would have nearly ended up in my arms. Howard tilted his head slightly, his eyes dazed, brows furrowed. "Why do you call him Kevin?" "What?" "You always call me Mr. Howard," he said. He was too close. I could barely focus. There was a faint, almost imperceptible scent on him. Was it his body odor, or the perfume left on his clothes? "Chloe." I struggled to stay composed, but my mind was foggy again. His expression was so innocent, unaware of how ambiguous his actions were. He was blind now, unable to see the chaos inside me. The beautiful man, fallen and blind, seemed as easy to obtain as a delicate glass lamp. If I just lowered my head slightly, I could kiss him. Would he think it was just my fingers touching him? Maybe I could deceive him. Bang! I suddenly stood up, knocking my chair over. Howard jumped in surprise, and I hurried to steady him, suppressing every feeling that surged inside me. "I call you Mr. Howard because you're my benefactor." "A benefactor can't be a friend?" "A benefactor is a benefactor." Kevin, hearing the noise, came out of the bathroom with a cigarette dangling from his lips. His wolf-like eyes stared at me sharply, and I quickly turned my head, hoping he hadn't read my thoughts. I only heard Kevin snicker derisively. After Howard went to bed, Kevin knocked on my door and entered my room. He casually sat down in my chair, the silver earring flashing in his ear as he tapped the table, like he had come to negotiate. "What do you really want? Howard shares? Company secrets? Connections?" I smiled. "I'm a manager in a traditional industry. I already have shares, secrets, and connections. Some I already have, and some I'm not interested in." "Why would you think that?" Kevin's face turned slightly red. At 18, his forced maturity crumbled in an instant. He scratched his head. "Then you must want something. You're not asking for." I stared at him helplessly, and he stammered, unable to finish his sentence, his face turning crimson. I sighed. "Do you watch comics?" "I have the rare edition of Crayon Shinchan." Kevin's face reddened further. Who the hell still watches Crayon Shinchan? Stop trying to change the subject. Maybe it was because he was Howard's adopted son, but when I looked at him, it felt like I was seeing Howard. My gaze softened involuntarily. "All right, what do you think I want?" He hesitated and finally managed to blurt out, "Sex." I was taken aback. Kevin looked at me awkwardly, dumbstruck, unable to speak, his face still flushed. When he saw that I wasn't embarrassed, but just surprised, he knew he had guessed wrong. Struggling with his own embarrassment, he spoke loudly, "Fine. I get it. Don't blame me. I'm good-looking, and I have a great body. Girls line up from the library to the cafeteria to chase me." His voice grew softer as he continued. "Who knows what you were thinking? He sponsored so many people, and you're the only one who came to him. I thought you really are naive. I misunderstood you. I'm sorry." He scratched his face, revealing a clean and well-defined muscle line on his arm. "I'm going to the living room to work out. You get back to your stuff." I couldn't help but laugh. Just as I chuckled lightly, I saw Kevin rush back into the room, grab a crayon Shinchan book, and quickly leave again, as if trying to escape. Who's the fool now? After Kevin went back to school, the house was left with just me and Howard. In the following days, I taught him how to distinguish the microwave buttons, where to find the lunch boxes, and helped him to get familiar with everything around the house. I also put anti-collision strips on the furniture to prevent him from getting hurt. I even bought a white cane for Howard, to help him walk around. But there was one thing that was particularly troublesome: bathing. I really didn't feel comfortable leaving Howard alone in the bathroom. But it also felt awkward to bring a little stool and sit outside the shower curtain while he bathed. Howard smiled bravely, but there was a vulnerability in it too. "It's fine, I can manage on my own." His words pushed away my last bit of hesitation. I couldn't just let him fall. I took Howard's hand, guiding him over the shower gel, shampoo, and the positions of the switches. Only after he had familiarized himself with everything did I finally feel reassured enough to draw the shower curtain. The sound of water filled the air, but my heart wasn't calm. I felt as if all my senses were suspended above the shower curtain. I clenched my fists, staring blankly at my legs, my gaze resolute. "Chloe." I wasn't sure if it was the echo in the bathroom, but his voice lingered, warm and gentle. I was going crazy. I stared at my hands, wishing I could physically throw all my thoughts far, far away, like they were nothing more than a nuisance. "Chloe? What's wrong?" I turned around. The shower curtain parted slightly, revealing an arm and a corner of his abs. He spread his palm out, looking confused, and asked, "I think I forgot, was this shower gel or shampoo?" "Shower gel," I replied, only realizing how tight my voice sounded. A strange thought tangled in my mind: did Howard somehow seem like he was trying to seduce me? He smiled. "I've gone blind, and now I'm getting clumsy." I immediately felt like a horrible person. "No," I whispered. In my heart, no matter how blind or poor he would always be that kind, smart man who could change the world. Even if he only changed a small corner of it, or just one insignificant person's fate. He wasn't clumsy or troublesome at all. The sound of water suddenly stopped. "I'm done, but I think I forgot to bring a change of clothes in." "It's fine, I'll get them for you." I picked up the neatly folded pile of clothes from his bed and handed them to him. "What's this?" "Your shirt. This side is the front." "And this?" "Your underwear, your shorts." Howard smiled and said thank you. He got dressed, and as he pulled the shower curtain open, I helped him walk out. Then he suddenly shifted his leg. "What's wrong?" I asked, noticing his awkward gait. Howard's ears turned red, and after asking for a long time without responding, he finally awkwardly whispered, "Chloe, the shorts. I think they're a bit too small." I coughed violently. I felt like I had somehow taken advantage of an innocent person. I went to work, and Howard stayed home. The days passed quietly. A few times, I came back early from work and heard voices from the guest bedroom, as if someone was on the phone or in a conference. The voice sounded vaguely like his, but it was different from the usual self-deprecating and fragile Howard. This voice was cool and distant, like someone at the top of the hierarchy, authoritative and unapproachable, not like Howard at all. Because I had someone to care for at home, I hurried home after work. This started to catch the attention of my colleagues. One of them jokingly asked, "Chloe, do you have a boyfriend?" I quickly shook my head. She clapped her hands. "Good," I was worried for a second. "The guy I introduced you to last time, he had a good impression of you. He wants to have another meal with you. How about it? Let's have dinner together today. That guy is really handsome, tall, and he works for the government." I vaguely remembered that the guy I met during the blind date was a nice person, a bit introverted but quiet and easy to get along with. My colleague was enthusiastic, and I really had no reason to turn her down, so I agreed. Before I left work, I called Howard to let him know I'd be late and had already ordered takeout for him. Howard didn't say much, only reminding me to take a taxi if I worked too late and to be careful on the way back. I was about to explain that I wasn't working overtime, but then realized these things didn't concern him. He was just being polite. If I explained too much, it would be annoying. After dinner with my blind date, it was already 8 o'clock, and my colleague, excited, insisted on dragging us to the movies. When I got a taxi back home, I checked my phone and saw several missed calls. From Howard. He had called every hour, as if waiting precisely for my return. He had also sent a message, "Chloe, where are you? I'm really worried about you." By the time I rushed home, Howard was sitting on the floor, drenched, soaked through completely. His eyes stared blankly into the void, the faint light from the lamp casting shadows on his thin cheekbones, making him seem even more pitiful. I immediately knelt down and started to carefully dry him with a towel. How did this happen? I slipped in the bathroom, hurt myself, and couldn't walk. Sorry, Chloe, I've caused you more trouble. Howard's voice was low. Where did you hurt yourself? I was frantic, quickly supporting his leg. His knee had turned a dark bruise. I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. I shouldn't have muted my phone for the movie, knowing there was someone sick at home. How could I have been so careless? I looked at Howard, who lowered his head, and whispered, "I'm sorry I came back so late." Howard shook his head. Where did you go? I met some friends. Howard's eyelids twitched. Seems like you had a good time. That's good. I really don't want my broken body to interfere with your life. You're not broken. And I don't think you're interfering. I hurriedly retorted. Howard's smile was pale. Is that so? I thought you didn't come back so late because you didn't want to stay with me anymore. He gave a bitter laugh. I'm so lonely. I can't see, and there's no one to talk to. That's why I impulsively called you. I'm sorry. It's my fault. You've been so kind to me already. I silently watched him and sighed, making a firm decision. You sit for a while. I'll get you a change of clothes. When I got to the guest bedroom, I sent a polite message to my blind date, saying that I had work to focus on and someone to take care of, so it wasn't a good time for a relationship. He didn't react much, politely thanking me and saying goodbye. We deleted each other on WeChat. I lowered my head, forced a smile. Maybe I wouldn't admit it, but Howard was like a sharp weapon that never showed blood. With just a slight frown, he made my self-control crumble. In the guest bedroom, Howard struggled to sit up, then staggered and collapsed back onto the bed. He spoke softly, "Sorry for making you laugh." He fumbled for his clothes, saying, "It's fine, I can dress myself." I couldn't stand it, and before I could stop myself, I said, "Let me help you." Worried that he might misunderstand, I quickly added, "Mr. Howard, don't worry. I'll cover my eyes. I won't look at you." Okay. I tied a scarf over my eyes, and then realized, even through the thin fabric, I could still vaguely make out his figure. But changing it now would be too troublesome. I deliberately lifted his hand and let him touch the scarf over my eyes. See? I've covered my eyes. You don't have to worry. The pants were difficult to take off. Howard sat on the bed, and I had to gently support him, slowly sliding the pants down bit by bit. When I reached his ankles, I had to lean down. With my vision blurred and all my focus on the pants, I didn't notice how close we were. My breath brushed against his skin. As I helped him, Howard suddenly asked softly, "Chloe, you can't see now either, can you?" I nodded. He laughed, his voice bright. "It's strange. I've dragged you into my blindness too." I was about to laugh, but then froze. Through the translucent fabric, I clearly saw the dark gray shorts stretch tighter, and a shadow appeared, very distinct. Howard's tone, however, remained unchanged, light and warm, casual and natural. "Tomorrow's the weekend again. Kevin is already complaining about coming over. I can't tell if he really misses me or just wants to skip his school team training." Yeah, I responded instinctively, but my mind was already blank. I checked and rechecked, my eyes weren't playing tricks. That shadow was definitely getting bigger. Suddenly, my fingers, resting on the waistband, felt as if they were burning. The sensation of my fingertips on his leg was unbearably sensitive. I gritted my teeth, my fingers slowly moving upward, my thoughts in turmoil. Should I act casual and continue helping him dress? Or stop? If I stop, he'll realize I can see. This could all be a misunderstanding. I didn't understand men. Perhaps it was just a natural, uncontrollable biological reaction. Howard might not have even noticed. He was such a polite person. If he knew I had seen this, he'd probably be so embarrassed he'd run off and jump out the window. I was terrified and unsure of what to do. The pants were now past his knees, approaching his hips. I swallowed hard. Suddenly, a hand pressed down on mine. I'll take care of the rest. Thank you. I exhaled in relief, handing the pants to Howard. As he put them on, he paused, coughed, and then said, "You haven't removed the scarf, have you?" Howard awkwardly added, "You can keep it on for now. Let's talk like two blind people." I flushed deeply, sitting down on the chair. Okay. For a moment, both of us, with our guilty thoughts, sat in silence. Only when little Howard settled down did big Howard raise his head, smiling at me again as he asked about tomorrow's plans. The adult world is truly full of people who know how to hide their true feelings, I thought to myself. I couldn't help but sigh. On the weekend, Kevin arrived. In these days, we'd been teasing each other and growing closer. Though Kevin looked fierce, he was actually very familiar with people and often called me by name in a friendly way. Howard had frowned at this, but Kevin, being young and stubborn, only grew more attached the more Howard tried to stop him. The more Howard advised him, the more Kevin insisted. It even made Howard cough, and I hurried to pat his back, saying in a good-natured way, "It's fine, really. It doesn't matter what you call me." Howard's cough left the corners of his eyes tinged with redness, and he turned to look at me with a mix of warmth and mild reproach, casting a glance. His gaze was so precise that, for a moment, I almost thought he had regained his sight. I was startled. But in the blink of an eye, Howard's gaze again became distant. It must have been a trick of my eyes. He spoke softly, "You're a person who values etiquette. I'm older than you, so you call me Mr., but he's younger than you, so you just call him by his name. Wouldn't it make you uncomfortable if Kevin called you by your first name?" I sighed, not wanting them to argue about me, so I gave in. "It really doesn't matter. I won't call you Mr. anymore, Howard." Saying his name made my throat tighten. It felt like we were suddenly closer. I began to feel nervous again, afraid that being too close would make it impossible to hide my feelings. Howard smiled. Kevin also smiled, though his laugh came out through his nose, sounding strange and somewhat charged with an inexplicable emotion. Kevin wasn't idle. While I cooked, he assisted me in the kitchen, though Howard had initially wanted to join, but I stopped him, urging him to rest instead. His injury hadn't fully healed yet, it was better for him to lie down. Kevin was cutting vegetables when, suddenly, he turned to me and said, "You care for him too much. It's not good." I chuckled, he looked too serious for someone so young, and his face made his words sound a bit childish. "Where's the problem?" Kevin squinted his eyes. "You're letting a wolf into the house. He's clever, always uses people. He tricked me all the time when I was little." I lightly tapped his back with a green onion. "Howard is your father. How can you say that about him?" "Adoptive father. He's not my real dad," he said reluctantly, grabbing the green onion and continuing to chop. "My dad asked him to take care of me when he was on his deathbed, and now I'm the one taking care of him." Kevin murmured, "I'm not as good as you, so patient. I'm just a rough guy. Without you, I don't even know how long I could keep this up." I said, "You're only in college. You've already done a lot." "You're not that much older than me," Kevin retorted, "and watch your tone, okay?" I laughed. Kevin was healthy, strong, and a bit rough around the edges. Being with him was easy, I didn't have to think too much. "You're still a kid, though," I teased him on purpose. These days, I'd started to think of him as a friend. "You still say that?" Kevin got up, threatening to tickle me. I raised the vegetables, stepping back until my back hit the counter. Kevin naturally leaned forward, bracing himself with his arms on either side of me, completely cornering me. He froze, suddenly realizing how close he was, how intimate it looked. I froze too. "Chloe, he stammered. "What are you two doing?" A curious voice interrupted Kevin's words. It was Howard, standing at the door, using his cane. He smiled lightly, as if nothing was amiss. "I heard you laughing. Having fun?" Before I could respond, Kevin didn't pull away. He kept his back to Howard, head down, expression unreadable. Howard carefully walked in, raising his hand to touch the pot, which was still hot. I hurried to push Kevin aside and grabbed Howard's wrist, urgently saying, "It's dangerous." Howard looked apologetic. "Sorry, I just saw you two having fun, and I wanted to join in." "We weren't having fun, just talking," I quickly reassured him. "The food's in the pot. Kevin, could you keep an eye on it for me while I stay with Howard?" Howard grabbed my wrist in return. He had leaned his cane against the doorframe, relying entirely on me for support. He said softly, "It's my fault for causing you trouble." "I can't see." "Can't you really see?" Kevin suddenly raised his voice. Howard stopped laughing and narrowed his eyes. In that instant, I felt an eerie similarity between the two, despite their apparent differences in demeanor and age. "Kevin, you shouldn't speak to elders like that," Howard said calmly. Kevin pushed me aside, leaning in close to Howard. "You always act so fragile, whining like a child. But now, in front of me, you're acting like the adult?" His words were confusing. Hadn't Howard been through enough with bankruptcy and blindness? Wasn't it okay for him to show some vulnerability? I felt angry and was about to shield Howard when Kevin, surprisingly, gripped Howard's shoulders and began pushing him away. "Chloe, I'll take care of him. You focus on your own stuff," Kevin said. I cooked with a distracted mind, and once the meal was ready, I called them to come eat. But when I opened the door, I was startled to see Kevin's face, bruised and dark. I froze for a moment, ready to ask what he was upset about, but then I noticed he was holding a small sculpture. I stopped in my tracks. Howard spoke slowly, "Chloe, this is my fault. I wanted to show him the tree sculpture you made, but I didn't expect." Kevin stared at me, his eyes cold, and sneered, "This is a tree sculpture?" He opened his hand. I could deceive Howard, but could I deceive Kevin? The sculpture clearly depicted Howard, his eyes half closed, looking down tenderly at a bouquet of flowers in his hands. It was beautiful, almost angelic. My carving skills weren't the best, but my feelings were exposed in the piece, without a photo of Howard, and not being especially close to him. I'd still managed to capture his likeness so vividly. I must have carved him with such attention that I'd imprinted his image deeply in my mind. This wasn't the sentiment one would feel for an ordinary benefactor. I stared silently at Kevin. "Say something." Kevin's voice was tense, as though he were provoked. I walked up to him, grabbing the sculpture out of his hands. I tilted my head up, mouthing the words, "Don't tell him." Kevin's brows twitched. He shot an expressionless glance at Howard, who was still unaware of what was going on. He closed his eyes, then suddenly leaned in close to my ear, his voice unpredictable. "If you keep this up, how can I trust you with him? What do you want then?" Kevin's gaze shifted slightly. "I won't say anything. But I want to stay here, not just on weekends. I want to stay 7 days a week, every day and night. He can't kick me out." I stared at him, smiling. "Kevin, you say Howard is manipulative. But when you speak, your thoughts are just as transparent. When did I unknowingly invite this young wolf into my life?" I sighed helplessly, pulling the sculpture from his grasp. "Deal." That day, Kevin moved his luggage in. When Howard found out, he wasn't very happy. I asked him about it, but he just shook his head. Taking care of me is already enough trouble for you, and now Kevin. When he said the last few words, I had the strange feeling Howard was gritting his teeth. He shook his head in frustration and regret, but I couldn't tell what he regretted. A few seconds later, he forced a smile and asked gently, "So what happened with the sculpture?" Kevin was upset after seeing it, but he didn't want to tell me. I had to ask you what it is that shouldn't be shown to others. I coughed awkwardly. It's nothing, Kevin's just scared of trees. While Kevin was packing, he glanced at me, and I glared back. He sighed in defeat and muttered, "Yes, I'm scared of trees." Howard didn't respond. That night, Howard developed a fever but refused to go to the hospital. Kevin insisted on staying with him, but Howard only squeezed my wrist and coughed to the side, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. I took it as a lucky chance, secretly delighted, and stayed to care for him. I draped a damp towel over his forehead. Howard gazed blankly at the air, and then said softly, "Chloe, all these years, I've supported so many people, but you're the only one who's unhesitatingly taken me in." There was a trace of vulnerability and loneliness in his voice, not too strong, but enough to stir something inside me. "I've already considered you a friend, like family," he said earnestly. I held back the turmoil rising in me, feigning calm. "Howard, I'm just repaying a debt." "Well, if you're my family, what do you think of Kevin?" Howard suddenly asked. "What?" My heart skipped a beat. For a moment, I thought he had figured out Kevin's feelings. But Howard only smiled. "He's also my family. I just want to know, how do you see him in the future?" I forced myself to remain composed, suppressing the unease inside. "To me, Kevin is just a kid." "You're only 24. You're not much older than him." "But school and work feel like two different worlds." "I always feel like I'm much older than him." Howard smiled. "No wonder you used to call me sir." "So you thought I was already old?" "No." He closed his eyes slightly, and some of the water from his handkerchief rolled down to his eye. I quickly wiped it away. His lips moved slightly, and he whispered, "If you think of him as a child, then what do you think of me?" I tightened my fingers. He couldn't see, but my face twisted in panic. When I lowered my gaze, I noticed that his eyes, which had always seemed dull and lifeless, gleamed with a sharp, cold light. They were so clear and intelligent, like they could see straight through me. I stammered, but then there was a knock on the door. Wasn't it already closed? I turned around. Kevin was leaning against the door, arms crossed, his face dark. Kevin and I nearly dragged each other into my room. He was pulling me, and I was pushing him. As soon as the door closed behind us, he spoke. "Why do you take care of him so much? He's got hands and feet, can't he wipe himself? What did you drag me here for?" I wasn't going to back down. "I haven't even finished talking." "What do you want to say?" Kevin snapped. "Do you want to say you treat him like a lover? Like a boyfriend?" His anger came out of nowhere, and it startled me, making me freeze instinctively. Kevin laughed bitterly. "You only have him in your eyes. To you, everyone else is just trash, right? Are you crazy?" I squinted. Kevin's expression was grim. "Don't tell me you still don't understand, I like you." "You like me? What does that change?" "I've been pretending nothing's wrong. If you weren't Mr. Howard's adopted son, I would've." I stopped abruptly. Kevin's angry gaze pierced through me, and tears welled up in his red eyes. He coldly asked, "What would you have done? Say it." I took a step back. "Calm down." Kevin grabbed my shoulder, his grip firm. He smiled bitterly. "Yes, you think I'm not calm, that I'm impulsive. But do you know what kind of lunatic Howard is?" I shoved at his arm, but he kept pressing me. "Do you know that after you took him in, he did everything to get your sympathy?" Kevin gripped my wrist tightly, his jealousy transforming his face into something unrecognizable. Howard pretends he can't use a fork, forces you to feed him. He throws himself at you. Every time I see this 30-year-old man acting pitiful, trying to look so helpless, I feel like I'm going to puke. My mind was in a whirlwind, but I managed to say, Mr. Howard isn't like that. He went bankrupt, he's blind. He's a little fragile and clumsy, but that's understandable. Kevin laughed bitterly. He pointed at me but couldn't find the words. He wiped away a tear from the corner of his eye and quietly asked, what if he's not really blind? What do you mean? That's impossible. I was stunned. Kevin suddenly lifted his head. His face was fierce, brimming with stubborn defiance. If you don't believe it, I can help you find out. What? I barely had time to react before Kevin shoved me onto the bed. Are you insane? Get off me. I was truly angry now. Kevin covered my mouth. Whatever happens, you need to cooperate. If you do, you'll find out the truth. Got it? I furrowed my brows, glaring at him. Are you out of your mind? Kevin lowered his eyes. Don't you want to know if he's faking it? If you don't try something hard enough, how will you ever find out the truth? I struggled, the bed creaking beneath me. Kevin pressed down on my wrist with desperation, and I cried out, just as I was about to speak. The door burst open. Howard hadn't knocked. This was nothing like his usual behavior. He stood silently in the doorway, facing the dimly lit room. His expression was unreadable. Kevin leaned his head against my shoulder, turning to look at Howard with a challenging glance. Howard asked calmly, what's going on? I heard some noise. Chloe, has Kevin been bullying you? Bullying? He'd practically crawled onto my bed and was on the verge of climbing on top of me. How could Howard remain so calm after seeing Kevin like this? I glared silently at Kevin. But Kevin stayed silent. He covered my mouth, making sure I couldn't say a word. The room was deathly quiet. Howard didn't leave. I shot Kevin a look of pure fury. Kevin smirked silently, slowly raising his head and inching closer to me. His lips were almost against mine, slowly closing the gap. Like sand slipping through an hourglass. The end was near, and the deadline was almost visible. I clenched my teeth, struggling harder. Kevin was strong from his sports background. No matter how much strength I used, I couldn't budge him. I could feel his breath on my face. My pupils dilated, and I cursed Kevin inwardly 1,000 times. He's crazy. If Howard wasn't blind, how could he was stripping in front of me? How could he not remember falling in the bathroom and waiting for me to come back all wet? If Howard weren't blind, how could he not recognize that the sculpture was of him? How could we ever go back to a peaceful relationship? But if Howard truly were blind, would Kevin actually kiss me? This madman. I turned my face away, eyes fixed on the mirror beside the wardrobe. The reflection in the mirror showed Howard's cheek twitching, as though he were biting down hard. What's wrong with him? Then, my cheek felt wet, breaking my train of thought. Kevin chuckled softly. Just kidding, I don't actually, was confirming whether Howard was blind or not. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang. I froze, my mind racing as I looked up in shock. Howard had grabbed Kevin by the waist with one arm and swung him off the bed. Kevin instinctively tried to block, but Howard elbowed him hard against the wall, making him gag. Fuck. Kevin had always had a bad temper. After being hit twice by Howard, he couldn't hold back anymore and threw a punch back. The floor cracked with the sound of impact. I never imagined I'd witness this. I sat on the bed, shouting at Howard and Kevin, "Stop fighting." 30 minutes later. Howard sat in the chair, his jacket slightly wrinkled. Kevin lay across the couch, looking like being unable to move. Howard spoke quietly, "I'm sorry. Actually, I fully recovered 3 days after I was discharged, but then..." He hesitated. "I saw the statue you made for me." "Chloe," he said, his dull eyes staring through me, his voice weak and trembling. "Don't be so kind to me. I'm 30. I'm not worthy of you. A tear slipped from his eye, falling silently onto the back of my hand. My heart softened, and before I could think too much about it, I instinctively bent down to wipe the tear away. But when I looked up, I caught Kevin's cold gaze fixed on us from the doorway. He spoke softly, his tone biting. Yeah, you're 30. Kevin, like a wild dog, stirred at the scent of competition. He stood up, eyes glinting with disdain. He looked at me, a mocking smile twisting his lips. I'm only 18. 18. Too young to understand the subtleties of respect and pretense. All he knew was how to fight for what he wanted, to provoke without reservation. My emotions were tangled as I glanced between Howard, who hung his head in self-doubt, and Kevin, who wore a defiant grin, cocking his head up arrogantly. How did we end up here? Howard said that Kevin's outburst meant he could no longer stay. I panicked. Where are you going? He lowered his head, his voice almost a whisper. I still have a few contacts. I can stay with them for a while. I felt a surge of frustration, unsure who to direct it at. Seeing him gather his things, suitcase in hand, I watched helplessly as he stepped toward the door. Without thinking, I grabbed his arm. Don't go. But I'm 30. I'm older than you're. How could I possibly be good enough for you? He murmured. I gripped his wrist, opened my mouth to say something, but hesitated for a long moment before finally managing to say, in the least romantic way possible, let's try and see. Howard smiled, but I saw the glint in his eyes that he thought he had already won. He looked so smug, so sure of himself. I sighed inwardly. Fine. Mr. Howard liked to play games. He liked to humble himself and make others praise him in return. Fine, I'd play along. After all, I liked him. I had liked him for years. Kevin's key had been taken by Howard. Bitterly, Kevin sulked downstairs, waiting for me. As I passed by with my groceries, he called out. I ignored him. He called again, more urgently, like a dog yapping for attention. I turned reluctantly and walked back toward him. Your daddy's making steaks today, are you coming upstairs? Kevin's face was red with anger and he followed my footsteps while yelling, I will never call he that. Howard opened the door with a smile on his face, and when he saw Kevin pop up behind me, his smile was sharp again. Kevin huffs, I don't like her anymore, you beat me into submission, okay? I want to eat. Howard smiled weakly at me, I'm old and senile, but only my cooking is still in your eyes. It's better to be young. I also said helplessly, when did I say young people are good? Howard looked at the two of us with satisfaction before he stepped aside and let us in. Now, after the revelation that he was pretending to be blind, he completely stopped pretending, and there were two computers on the sofa. It seemed that he had just finished dealing with work. Kevin casually asked, aren't you cooking? How come you still have the heart to play with computers? Howard smiled and said, not playing, the family is in dire straits, how can I feel comfortable to be the one who eats? I failed in my previous bet, but I still have a little bit of business left, so I have to start up again, after all, I still have to support my family. Kevin heard this, just stuffed into the mouth of a mouthful of free white rice, a long time to swallow, nausea, face green for a while, white for a while. Howard was indeed awesome. Within a month, he'd handed me a large sum of money to pay the rent. At that point, we were still lying in bed, debating the pros and cons of having age difference. I looked at the bank card in my hand, thinking how my exhausting commute didn't even compare to what Howard made while pretending to be blind. I couldn't help but mutter a curse. Howard's face twisted in panic. Did I upset you? Did I not take care of you well enough? Before I could respond, he dove under the covers. 2 years into our relationship, Howard had launched a new company, and it was booming. He became a rising star in the business world, and one by one, he started settling scores with everyone who had ever doubted or mistreated him during his fall from grace. When the door was closed, the world outside disappeared, no more noise, no more drama. Howard held me close, lying on the couch. My eyes are starting to fail again. Will you help me wash up? I was holding a financial magazine, distracted by a headline, "Scavengers are still undefeatable. Howard, who took down company titan, claims his business empire is just a stepping stone to marriage." Beneath the headline was a picture of Howard, eyes cold, two fingers gripping a microphone, looking every bit the commanding businessman he had become. The watch on his wrist, mine, a gift from last month. I glanced over at Howard, lying next to me, his eyes unfocused, the same man who once seemed so fragile. How could the sharp businessman in the article be the same as my tender, broken Howard? "Want to wash up?" he teased. I sighed. Fine, fine. I'll do it. But can I ask you something first? What? When did you start liking me? Well. He hesitated. When you let me take care of you. Howard smiled. But I really fell for you that day in the sun. When I suddenly got my sight back, and I saw the light, the clouds, the sky, and then I turned, and there you were. You stood in the sunlight, your eyes shining like you were a goddess. He laughed softly, shaking his head. And at that moment, I was terrified. I thought, what if you find out I'm not blind anymore? What if you leave me? So I decided to stay just a little longer, to make sure you couldn't live without me. Howard leaned closer, his lips brushing my ear. And then I was going to tell you, I've been watching you for so long, loving you for so long. He sighed and chuckled. But, well, all that romantic planning was ruined by that little bastard, Kevin. I squinted, trying to recall that day. So when you pulled back the shower curtain, you could really tell the difference between shampoo and body wash? That's the second question, love. You promised only one. But. La 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 la, he started singing loudly, cutting me off. Then he scooped me up in his arms, running toward the bathroom, bouncing me so hard I couldn't speak. He tossed me into the tub with a grin. And then Howard leaned over, his smile as beautiful as a peach blossom, kissing me until I couldn't think of a single question left. The end.